Many working-class Victorians lived day to day and particularly with itinerant work or manual labour. Paid by the hour or task, you could never be sure that you'd go home at night with enough money for your family to eat, let alone pay the rent. Society offered no safety net. Put simply, if you couldn't gain admittance to the workhouse casual ward for a roof over your head and some food in your stomach, you would starve on the streets, until you were lucky enough to find a job again, and that was no easy task for a hungry man, made too weak to even search, let alone do a day's work. For most men living in London's East End, that work was casual labour and found in the docks. Hard physical labour, unloading goods from ships. Work ebbed and flowed, and dockers worked or didn't work according to the amount of goods on hand to be moved. There was often more men than work available, and fights were frequent at the gates to get a token giving permission to enter. Competition was relentless, and it's astonishing that they found the energy to work at all after struggling to gain position at the front of the crowd. They often stood miserably clad, scarcely with a boot on their foot, without having a bit of food in their stomachs, perhaps since an hour's work the previous day which paid for some bread. It's little wonder that a lot of men lived a transient existence sleeping in cheap lodging houses when they earned a few pennies, and if they had families they were forced to rent cheap and filthy rooms. The misery and chaos at the docks was widely known. The church and philanthropists did come up with a specific plan to tackle the issue, but, as you will hear later in this video, their solution to there being more unskilled labourers than casual work available wasn't just soup and salvation for these desperate men, but a one-way ticket to Australia or Canada. Find out, in this account by a Victorian journalist, how men fought in chaotic crowds for the chance to work, and if they were lucky enough to get a ticket for an hour's work, the money earned was barely enough to eat. For many labourers, life was a marginal existence. One night you might sleep in a cheap lodging house, the next in the workhouse casual ward or on a park bench. But men out of work kept drifting towards the docks because they faced a stark choice: fight for a ticket or starve on the cold, hard streets. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. In sunshine or shower, fog or fair weather, the approaches to the docks and wharves of the metropolis are every morning thronged by crowds of eager, anxious men, struggling, nay, in many cases fighting like wild beasts, to obtain work within the gates. As the hour draws near for the ringing of the great bell announcing the commencement of work, a crowd of often a couple of thousand men press around the principal entrance of the London docks, and as the big gates swing slowly open, the mighty mass of humanity rushes forward like an overwhelming flood to the chain barrier where the superintendent gives out the metal tokens, entitling the holder to employment within. Of course, he shows preference to those previously employed, but there is always the chance of obtaining a ticket, and the men strive to clutch one of the precious talismans with intense and passionate eagerness. They push and jostle and struggle, leaping on each other's shoulders and fighting and wrestling in the mad rush like famishing animals rather than human beings. The most desperate determination is written on every face, and there is small thought in the mind of any man of that surging crowd for anyone but himself. For work means food, poor and scanty no doubt, but still something to keep the terrible wolf from the door. Failure means semi-starvation, or worse. But of the crowds who struggle and fight at the gates, frequently not more than 1/3 are selected, and the remainder, bearing their sad fate with as much philosophical fortitude as they can muster, perhaps it is stony despair, rather, turn disconsolately away. Some to seek work at other places which open later, and others to wait for calls, which may occur at any time during the day. Thus a visitor strolling through the fine docks and admiring the shipping and immense quantities of merchandise piled on every hand is suddenly arrested by the strange sight of a sea of white, anxious faces pressing wistfully against the bars of a side entrance. Yes, men are still waiting there for any call for labourers that may come during the day, and presently, you wait, the superintendent appears and cries, "One man wanted!" Instantly all the watchers spring up like caged animals when food is brought them, yelling, shouting, and extending their hands. They leap on each other's backs and clamber up to the topmost rails, and all this feverish excitement is to obtain one little metal ticket, perhaps for 1 hour's work, entitling the owner to 5 pence or 6 pence at most. One out of the large number receives the ticket, apparently by chance rather than by any other manner of selection, and then the noise subsides, and the men wait on, patient, dogged, hungry-eyed, as before. At another time a call will come for 2 men, and the same scene will occur again, and so on throughout the day. But of the great numbers who crowd the gates in their desperate struggle to obtain employment, only a very few comparatively can ever be engaged. 1 in every 3 or 4 appears to be the average number who obtain work. From a return of the wages received and of the employment obtained for a month by 20 dock labourers, taken indiscriminately from the crowd, the following startling results were obtained. That 12 hours' work per week was the average amount of employment gained, yielding a wage of 5 or 6 shillings per week, according to the rate of pay. Some of the men were married and had to support families upon this scanty sum, supplemented perhaps by the charring or needlework obtained by the wives. The details of the return, however, which yielded this average, are even more startling. Thus, 2 out of the 20 only earned an average of 9 pence per week, their number of hours' employment being 9 in the 4 weeks, and the rate of pay, which appears to vary at various wharfs and docks and according to the work done, being only 4 pence per hour. The greatest number of hours' work in the 4 weeks was 162, which at 5 pence per hour yielded £3 7 shillings and 6 pence for the month, or an average of 16 shillings 10.5 pence per week. This was the highest obtained. One other earned an average of 15 shillings per week, another 10 shillings 1.5 pence, one more 7 shillings 3.5 pence, but all the others 5 shillings 10 pence or 4 shillings 2 pence, 3 shillings or 2 shillings 9 pence, while some were as low as 1 shilling 6 pence, and 2, as we have said, were 9 pence only, the exact average being 4 shillings 11.75 pence per week. We venture to think that this return gives a very fair indication of the earnings of the ordinary, casual, dock labourers of the Port of London, and when we add that, according to the statement of one of the men themselves, a very intelligent fellow, and fit for work far above this employment, there are no less than 50,000 such men engaged at the various wharfs and docks of the metropolis, and of this 50,000, only 5,000 obtain anything like regular work. We get a very fair idea of the desperate and widespread poverty of the East End of London. It is but just, however, to state that another calculation places the number at only 12,000, but even if this be so, the fact remains that at least 3/4 get but little work, and that their average earnings are the miserable pittances just stated. It is impossible to make an accurate calculation of the numbers really engaged in seeking this work, for they are always varying. Sometimes there are more and sometimes less, but always a large proportion are unemployed. Their ranks are continually being reinforced by men of almost every calling, and from all quarters of the huge city. Being unable to obtain other work, from their own trade being oversupplied or other causes, they drift down to the docks, where there is always a chance, they think, and a very poor chance many of them find it. Hour after hour they linger at the gates for the chance that is seized by the very few, and their hearts grow sick and heavy indeed at the hope deferred. These men walk here in the early morning from all parts, Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, Southwark, Bermondsey, Hoxton, Rotherhithe, etc. But as very many ships are now unloaded at the Victoria docks, lower down the river, the difficulty of getting early to the scene of work becomes greater for those who live so far west as Whitechapel. A large proportion, however, are unable to pay for any fixed place of abode. They either spend the night dossing out, that is, sleeping on the bridges under archways in courts and alleys, etc., or in the cheap threepenny or fourpenny lodging houses, familiarly known as dossing houses. It is almost impossible to imagine what the state of London streets without these common lodging houses would be. For thousands, we suppose, instead of hundreds, would be forced to pass the night in the open air, or the casual wards would have to be enlarged. For threepence or fourpence, as the case may be, a man can obtain 24 hours shelter in one of these lodging houses. Below, in the basement, is the large washing room, where the inmates can wash themselves and their clothes also, and hang the latter to dry before a large furnace of a fire. On the ground floor is the kitchen, where food can be cooked and eaten at the tables standing round the room. Above are the sleeping apartments, filled with rows of small iron bedsteads, covered with coarse sheets and blankets. The presence of this immense mass of poverty, of partially employed and of unemployed men in our midst, affords food for serious thought, and suggests many anxious considerations, which, however, cannot be now pursued. The cause of so much distress among the dock labourers is, of course, the uncertainty and precariousness of the work. Vessels come and go, sometimes the docks are full, sometimes nearly empty, and the number of hands required to load and unload varies almost from hour to hour. But there is another consideration, that this is unskilled labour, and the point to be noted is that many of these men who struggle daily at the dock gates are unskilled workmen, or, if they know a trade, they are inefficient workers. Doubtless this is not the case with all, for many drift here because, as we have said, their own trade is oversupplied with workers, but the fact remains that, speaking broadly, the ranks of the unemployed are recruited with the unskilled or inefficient workers. It is this fact which gives so much point to the argument of Mr. Samuel Smith, the philanthropic MP for Liverpool, for the industrial training of children. Without, however, discussing such debatable questions as the training to be given in board schools, we may point out that emigration forms a ready method by which many of these poor strugglers for work may be helped to improve their condition, and it is to assist such able-bodied men as are willing to seek their bread in one of our young Englands over the sea that the London Congregational Union, in the spring of the year, determined to organise a scheme of emigration to Canada or Western Australia. Breakfasts and suppers were given occasionally in the borough at Collier's Rents Hall, which belongs to the Union, to the unemployed, and the meal was followed by discussions and speeches with the object of eliciting facts from the men themselves and interesting them in emigration. Baron Rothschild, Lord Carrington, also Captain Colum, and Mr. Tuke, who have been so successful in assisting families to emigrate from the west of Ireland, spoke to the men on different occasions and gave good advice. After the meeting, the applicants for emigration are seen and their cases inquired into. The cost of outfit and passage averages £7, and many men, some with and some without families, have been helped from the Special Emigration Fund of the Union to avail themselves of this opportunity. It is needless to say that each case is stringently inquired into, and further, each candidate has to pass the emigration agent of the colony to which it is proposed to send him. Arrangements have also been made to receive the emigrants on their arrival in the new country, and to take them in charge until they are fairly started. But as each emigrant costs from £7 to £10, it is quite clear that a liberal support of the funds is required from a benevolent public. A society has also been formed in connection with the Church of England for the purpose of dealing with the question of emigration. Canon Prothero, rector of Whippingham, is the chairman, and amongst the members of the council is the emigrants' chaplain, the Reverend A. Nicholas, Liverpool, who sailed to Canada with the first party of emigrants towards the end of last April. The Society has obtained a large tract of land in Manitoba on very advantageous terms, and settlers who take advantage of the proposals of the Society are placed upon this land and assisted to establish themselves and cultivate their portion of the territory. Out of the money subscribed, a tenth part is put aside to provide the settlers with religious ministrations. The objects of these two movements, though different in details and in their methods of working, are much the same, and it is these only which we notice here, the seeking to relieve the dire distress prevailing among portions of the industrial classes by assisting them to emigrate. Every person who is thus helped to found a happy home for himself over the sea serves but to rivet still firmer the links which bind our young Englands to the mother country.